Welcome to How Brands Are Built, where branding professionals get into the details of what they do and how they do it. I'm your host, Rob Meyerson. Thanks for listening. This episode and the entire season is brought to you by Squad Help, the world's #1 naming platform. To use Squad Help and launch a naming contest today, go to squadhelp.com and start receiving custom name suggestions instantly. Today's episode features Tim Riches, Group Strategy Director at Principles, which is a Melbourne-based branding agency. When I arrived at FutureBrand in Singapore, Tim was running the office, as well as serving as Chief Growth Officer for all of Asia Pacific. He left shortly after I got there. Nothing personal, I hope. But in the few months we overlapped, Tim made a big impression. He's a fast-talking, no-bullshit, powerhouse thinker who often seems to be offering solutions before anyone else in the room has even fully grasped the problem. I wanted to ask Tim about an article he'd just written in Mumbrella, an Australian media and marketing publication, about the biggest change branding agencies face today. And in the middle of the conversation, you'll hear us somewhat awkwardly segue to a long-running back and forth we've had about the balance between structure and flexibility in brand strategy frameworks. On an earlier episode, you may have heard me refer to a friend who called more rigid strategy frameworks parking lots. That was Tim. Here's the conversation. I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed having it. Tim Riches, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Rob.
So, Tim, you wrote an article recently in Mumbrella titled "The Greatest Change Branding Agencies Have Faced in a Generation." What's that change that you were talking about?
Well, I guess I won't answer that question. Let me answer a different question, which is why did I write the article? Which was, I suppose, the agency that I work at now, Principles. We've been, like a lot of agencies, I think, across the sort of marketing services spectrum, giving some serious thought to what the sort of future shape of the agency is from a capability point of view. I suppose the key things that we've experienced and that I capture in the article are the implications on branding agencies of the shift in focus on the client side towards what you might broadly call customer experience, so away from sort of marketing as being the main business lens on the customer relationship to this wider sort of even more amorphous concept perhaps of customer experience.
And you mentioned digital specifically, and so that's obviously one aspect of a brand experience in many cases. So is it partly that the breadth of touch points, I suppose, that are considered part of a brand experience has changed dramatically recently, or is it that the kinds of experiences that consumers expect is changing?
I think both of those things are true, but I think looking at it more from a business point of view and how you sustain, as an agency, how you sustain a relevant business value proposition to your client, I think while those things are true, the business response, I suppose, has been to invest heavily in the digitization of the layer that sits between the organisation and its customers. And that layer is obviously is different in different instances based on the kinds of business, what the business is selling. But I mean, for example, we recently rebranded a large energy company here in Australia called AGL. And the scope and scale of their digital transformation project is just extraordinary. So they've been doing a lot of work with other consultancies around what the future of the customer experience might be in a very, very low involvement, low engagement, low touch category like energy, where in some respects the best kind of customer experience is quite set and forget. So, you choose your plan. You ideally, I think, in some respects, opt for sort of automated direct debit style payment, but they've been spending an enormous amount of money, energy, and corporate focus on the digitisation of their relationship with their customers to reduce the cost to serve the customer and to improve the quality of the customer's experience. And I suppose that if, as a branding agency, we can't be useful in that world, then essentially, that sort of finite pool of, and it's not just money, I think, it's actually just senior attention, if you like. As the senior leadership attention moves to this agenda around digitisation, and the digitisation piece becomes pretty rapidly synonymous with this concept of customer experience, then as I say, if we need to sort of tap the revenue veins of the client, unless we're tapping that kind of vein, unless we're useful in that kind of realm, then we're not playing the main game, we're playing the sideshow.
Right. Does it mean that we actually need to change anything that we're doing as brand strategists? Is it a different kind of brand strategy or a different delivery method or a different way of testing the strategy once it's been recommended?
I think what it does is it calls into question what aspect of strategy is most useful and valuable to clients, what aspect of brand strategy is most useful and valuable to clients. We see the job of brand strategy in this context as building a bridge between the promise of the brand and the delivery of that promise. And when I say a bridge, I mean actionable principles that experienced designers can use to deliver the pillars of the brand or the key chunks of meaning of the brand, whichever aspect of the brand you're thinking about, whether that be the personality traits of the brand, the stylistic characteristics, or whether it be the overarching sort of promise or essence. In general, the traditional articulations of brand strategy, which tend to be anchored more in things like storytelling or sort of, messages or ideas, they don't necessarily lend themselves to use by an experienced designer. And when I say experienced designer, I don't only mean digital design, but also things like service design, employee experience, that more holistic view that I think organisations are taking towards, as you mentioned, that breadth of touch points across which, brands play out.
And at Principles, those different aspects of experience design, are those talents or skill sets that you have in-house, or are you often partnering with other vendors to do some of that work?
Look, in some ways, it's very similar to the way that branding agencies have always worked with clients and other players within client rosters. Mm-hmm. So, traditionally, big ad agencies, for example, and as a branding agency, you always need to understand what your sort of specific domain of expertise, how that's perceived by the client. And like all agencies, you want to stretch the boundaries of that to increase your influence and create a more highly valued, more enduring relationship. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to this area, what we're finding is as much the client's in-house capability that you're working with as it is necessarily other external partners. So in terms of what we have been building in-house, I think this is the real critical thing for agencies, and I suppose the thought process that we went through as a business was essentially calling into question, what are we? We have been a brand consultancy. Do we wish to continue to be a brand consultancy? And if that is the case, then what does that look like? What does that capability look like in the future? So what we didn't say is we used to be a brand consultancy and now we are a customer experience agency, which I would say between 40 and 97% of Australian agencies Australian agencies at least seem to have gone down that path, right? They seem to have said, we used to be an ad agency, now we're a CX agency. Mm-hmm. We used to be a direct marketing business, now we're a CX agency. We used to be a retail design, business, design physical environments, and now I'm an experience agency.
They're all jumping on the same buzzword bandwagon.
Well, I think they're responding to the same phenomena that we were talking about earlier, but I don't personally think that's a smart way to do it, because I think that one of the intrinsic characteristics of this concept of experience is its breadth. And so therefore it's, I think, generally unhelpful, particularly if, like us, we work with larger clients. You are not their sort of one-stop transformation shop, if you like. Then I think you need to say what your capability is. So as a brand agency, it's about how we've evolved our capability. And I think I speak in the article about it's almost like learning other languages, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you necessarily – it's a bit like moving to a different country, Well, you and I work together in Singapore, right? But if you go do work in Japan, it doesn't necessarily mean you surround yourself with hundreds of Japanese people to do that work. But it does mean that you probably need a sufficient level of cultural and linguistic fluency about the environment in Japan to successfully do your work. And that's the sort of analogy that we've used, I suppose. So we have brought some people into the business that bring different capabilities and skill set, but our objective is not to necessarily go, because we will never win a straight up pitch or fight against an AKQA or a Deloitte Digital or an Accenture Interactive, because we don't want it to be that kind of business, and there's just a different weight division entirely in a different kind of fight. But The question is what our clients can get from us is not what they can get from those others, but we need sufficient fluency to understand how to build that bridge between the concept of brand, particularly that more promise and message-oriented, story-oriented concept of brand, and that more experientially oriented concept of brand.
I see. So I take it that means writing, in some cases, some form of experience principles or something that you have come to understand that these people, whether they're inside the organization or other vendors, will be able to interpret and use as input for some element of the experience, some part of the brand experience.
That's right. That's right.
Have you found anything that seems to work especially well? I don't know what you can share, but just is there a process or a way of writing these principles that seems to make more sense?
Yeah, I mean, what we've found, particularly when working with larger organizations, is that teams, experience design teams, and particularly digital design teams, because the design process and outputs are, in a sense, more tangible sometimes in the digital design context than perhaps sometimes they are in a service design context. But in both of these, fundamentally, they're the two realms that we need to have influence and participation in, and we need to ideally equip. What we generally find is that larger organizations have some design principles that they use. Now, the problem oftentimes is that those design principles are fairly generic UX sort of concepts.
Best practices.
They are either, I think, best practices, or they are the accumulation of innumerable A/B tests that these guys have done over time at a very granular kind of a level and have laddered up into these we know this works types of design principles. So they're not always, I think, as, if you like, considered and wide-ranging as best practice, but sometimes I think they are more almost customary, if you like, have emerged in a kind of organic way. So what we, from a process point of view, it's like it's like all parts of brand strategy. There is a level of engagement required to do it well, to understand the implicit or sort of de facto design principles that may be inside the organization. Now, sometimes they're written down, right? I'm sure you and most brand consultants these days have experienced manifestations of these new forms of silos, whereby you'll find something that might be called, say, a gel or a sort of a UI kit or something like that, which is essentially sort of like the digital design guidelines. Mm-hmm. And then you'll find the brand team has got their brand guidelines. And there's generally a resemblance between the two, but there's often important differences, And that's a great example of the bridges I was talking about before, right? I mean, at a strategy level, there's a bridge to be built. We have to create principles that connect, that enable a designer in their design decision-making to translate that strategic intent, whichever one we're sort of talking about.
Today's episode of How Brands Are Built is brought to you by SquadHelp, the world's #1 naming platform. Here's how SquadHelp works. You launch a naming contest to engage hundreds of naming experts. You're guided through an agency-level naming process that goes beyond traditional crowdsourcing. The platform uses AI and includes name validation features such as audience testing, trademark validation, linguistic analysis, and quality scoring. And SquadHelp doesn't just do naming. You can also use their platform for taglines or slogans, as well as logo design. To launch your naming contest today, go to squadhelp.com and start receiving custom name suggestions instantly. SquadHelp, company, brand, and business name ideas by experts. This episode is also brought to you by Rev.com, offering fast, affordable, accurate audio transcription and captions. I use Rev all the time. I use it to transcribe episodes of this podcast, and I've also used it on client projects to transcribe interviews. I've tried some other services, and I keep coming back to Rev because their transcriptions are the most accurate I've seen, their turnaround time is less than 24 hours, and transcriptions cost just $1 a minute. Right now, Rev is offering listeners of this show $10 off your first order. To get that $10 coupon, visit rev.com/blog/HBAB for How Brands Are Built. Again, that's rev.com/blog/HBAB. Rev. Transcriptions made simple. How do you strike the right balance between creating something that's unique to the brand versus following some of these best practices or consumer expectations, maybe especially for digital experiences. I've heard a lot of talk of, you don't want to break the consumer's expectations by doing something unique, but also, of course, we want to make sure that we're differentiating in some way.
I mean, it makes me sound really old when I say this, but this is just today's manifestation of the perennial branding problem, right? And the perennial branding problem is the push-pull between fitting in and standing out. Or in the whole history of branding, to position a brand effectively, you need to fit in to some degree. You need to be, to some extent, nearly all of the time, you need to be recognisably insert category here. You need to be recognisably, generally, an energy company if you're an energy company, or a bank if you're a bank. And you almost always need to understand what those kind of category norms and category conventions are, if only to break them, in a considered way. This new world of, as you say, the sort of almost templated design that you see in so much digital design now, the argument for which is almost always consumer familiarity, right? So I want seamless, I want simple, I want the fewest number of clicks, I want the least, I don't want to give them any unnecessary mental processing as they work their way through my digital journey. And it drives you to homogeneity.
Right.
It absolutely does drive you to homogeneity. Now, the great brands over time have always been the ones that have both fitted in and stood out. So when you go and do that work around what are those, how do you create these experience design principles, oftentimes, quite honestly, it's about re-describing, re-articulating what may be relatively generic UX principles in a way that conceptually aligns to the brand strategy. Which brings us to the question of frameworks. Should they be rigid and should they be fluid?
Thanks for making the segue for me. I was about to get to that. We both worked with frameworks that are, for lack of a better word, somewhat rigid. They have a certain number of boxes, and maybe you can expand that number, but there's usually a one-to-one relationship between things like pillars and values and personality traits. I've had a lot of conversations for this season of this podcast where people are somewhat consistently advocating for a much less rigid and more flexible approach where there's no number of things that you need to consider in your brand strategy and there's no type or classification of those things that you consider. It's effectively just a list of things that are important about our brand without any prescribed definitions around that at all.
If there's no structure, then you can't build a bridge. That'd be my point. Because the bridge is built on that intellectual sort of connectivity or the fact that, I don't know why this is, and I don't pretend that this is in any way scientific, but from my experience, we tend to naturally land on 4 pillars. And I've, I suppose, over the years come back to some of the simple tests, like what are we famous for? That's, in my mind, the idea of the brand pillar. I suppose sometimes that word attribute is used.
Right.
I like the word pillar. The reason I like the word pillar is the word pillar evokes the fact that they play a supporting role, that they ladder up to something. And I think this is the problem with the random parking lots kind of scenario. Nothing ladders up to anything else. So if you think you want to own a big idea in people's minds, how the hell do you connect the complexity of my values, my brand personality traits, and my attributes or pillars to bring up that big idea? How do you define what is a proof point?
Right.
How do you give kind of coherence? How do you create principles that people can use to simply ask themselves, am I, if I'm doing some innovation work, how should I think about how different innovation ideas further my brand? Or if I'm doing, things like, copywriting or checking things for sort of tonal correctness and that sort of thing, what simple checkboxes can I equip the increasingly large population of content creators to work with to deliver stuff that feels like it has a voice and it has a point of view and has a tone, a style, a personality that is consistent with the business strategy. I don't see how you can create a cohesive story unless there is some relationship. I know typically the way we tend to do it, or the way I've always done it, I guess, is to try and create almost a vertical alignment between things.
Right.
At least trying to do that helps you show where you have disjoints and incongruities within the thinking,
So a vertical alignment meaning, for example, that you do have, say, 4 pillars, that you would then also have 4 say, brand personality traits, and there would be a one-to-one mapping between them. And it sounds like you're saying you're doing that less because you think it's a rule or something like that people should follow in order to be doing brand strategy properly, and more because it's a useful test as to whether your thinking makes sense, as to whether there's any coherence or structure to your thinking.
Correct. So if you have company values and company purpose, that when you feed them in, if there's 4 or 5 company values, if you try and line them up with 4 pillars, for example, that you're trying to create for this brand, if there's no relationship, you're in deep shit, right? Because your values, surely you are, because, you're trying to engage if you're not trying to engage your organisation around its values and hold ourselves and each other accountable to those values, then why do you have the values, right?
Sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need that relationship to be one-to-one, right? It could be that one of those values really supports 2 of the pillars and so on.
Correct. Yeah, and you typically end up with a bit of a patchwork of these things. But by trying to align them, you quickly and clearly identify where you might have a value that is actually at odds with, and therefore highly dilutive with one of your brand pillars.
I see.
I always call it the gold medal. If you can get one-to-one relationships across everything, I think it does hugely help to deliver some simplicity and some coherence overall. It happens, in my experience, about 1 time out of 10 that you actually get there. But by trying, you get, I think, you create a framework for a great, healthy discussion with your client about what fits and what doesn't fit. What are we doing? Where are we pulling in opposite directions, and where are we well aligned?
Let's segue or transition, I should say, to some of these wrap-up questions. Are there any brands out there right now that you feel like are doing an especially good job, whether it's something we would have heard of, a global brand or not?
I hate that question because I genuinely don't. I don't generally have a handful of go-tos that I would typically use in my own mind or with clients to say, oh, yeah, these guys are doing it well, we should be doing it like them. Are there brands that I like? Yes, there are brands that I like. I mean, I like Qantas. I like to fly Qantas. I think, the Qantas, even when the plane interiors themselves aren't great, there's something about that brand that I like. I like the lounges. I like the style of the brand. I like the way that it does express in a contemporary way Australian identity. I like the fact that it is a respected brand globally. So I feel a little bit of a sense of national pride, if I'm honest, in that brand. Sure. It's a brand that's been through quite a lot, from a business point of view, and has come out the other end. It's participated in social change, things like the push for same-sex marriage here. I mean, it's a brand that I like, and would I say, are they doing it well? I'm not a big fan of their visual identity in some respects. There's things that I would pick holes in absolutely every day of the week. But overall, I find them a likable, relatable brand. But that answer, honestly, is more from a consumer's point of view than it is necessarily from a brand consultant's point of view. And I like Netflix. Netflix is a brand that kind of slots into my life in a way that works extraordinarily well. I just moved house to an older house that has a shit internet connection. Yet somehow Netflix seems to work smoothly and seamlessly, and the Netflix experience remains the Netflix experience, and I can enjoy my latest episodes of Chef's Table or The Bodyguard or whatever, and it looks way better than it has any right to, given the poor quality of our internet connection. So,
let's talk about books. Are there any that you've read either recently or that you remember from earlier in your career that influenced you somehow? Could be a brand or business book, or it could just be something else that somehow feeds into your day-to-day strategy practice. I
think my sort of regular diet is, I love The Economist. Mm-hmm. I think that is a great brand. Perhaps I should have thought of that before when it was a great brand. It is a great brand, and I love reading it because it makes me feel smart and it gives me intelligent sounding things to say, and it I think helps you maintain a sense of context. And I think, as I said before, that idea of context and how we as individuals and how you help a brand respond and be relevant to a wider context. I don't think there's any better reading material for wide context than The Economist. So and it's an enjoyable read because it's beautifully written, and even the boring articles are somehow readable. I've always loved science fiction books, and I continue to read them. I'm a firm believer in in the idea that, the William Gibson quote that the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed, and also that there's nothing that humans will ever encounter or invent that hasn't been already imagined by a science fiction writer. So I think both of those things are true, and I think that is useful. To self-justify and rationalise the time I waste with science fiction, I like to say that it's good fuel for the imagination, and I do think strategists have to have imagination, not just analytical skills. And from a business book point of view, I found some of the sort of behavioural psychology types of cognitive psych kind of books interesting, and sufficiently interesting to sort of make time in my sci-fi and Economist schedule to slot a little bit in. But things like at the heavy and difficult end, the Fast and Slow Thinking book I thought was good. And it's the sort of stuff you need to be across. I think that's the point, right? There's a difference between reading the book and at least being across the general ideas of it. So sometimes it's just about reading a book review in the back of the bloody Economist about that book. That can sometimes be enough.
Well, last question. Given the success you've had in your career and all the different roles that you've had across Singapore and Melbourne and different parts of the marketing realm, what kind of advice do you have for younger people that are interested in getting into brand strategy or just marketing more generally?
I think it's very tricky to give people advice on this topic, because how you may enter it is becoming increasingly diverse, I would say, in terms of doing good work. And I think this is important advice for a younger person, I suppose, going in the practice of strategy, if not necessarily breaking into the field, sort of quote unquote, but being focused on the problem that you're solving, or what is the most important problem to solve, or slash what does value look like for the client, is such a critical thing to bear in mind. As a strategy practitioner, it's super easy to get sort of drawn into, I find this even more the case in areas like human-centered design. Practitioners get fucking obsessed with methodology.
Right, without asking about whether they're delivering any value.
Correct. Why? And you get these people that become methodology evangelists, which I don't get that. I don't. And yeah, I think it's quite easy for people earlier in their career, because methodology is easily learned and it's codified, and you can go learn it from, go learn it from IDEO or somewhere like that, right?
Mm-hmm. And they have to latch onto something because they don't have the experience to latch onto.
That's right, and and they're not in the conversation, right? They're not in that higher, more senior conversation, because the senior conversations around why are we doing this and what does good look like, which people like me have with clients. Mm-hmm. There's a version of that way of thinking that needs to be embraced by younger people, particularly by more junior people, I should say, particularly in very amorphous areas like brand. It's super important that you have that. But I will also come back to the point that it is important to have. You will progress further faster if you have good practitioner skills as well. Right. So things like being able to run a good interview, being able to present well, being able to design and facilitate a workshop. These are important skills, which, in my own case, I'm very fortunate because I kind of got through that phase without really having a lot of training or looking back on a huge amount of skill in any of those things, frankly. I think I have some talent for some of those things, but I never really had a lot of expertise in terms of learned skills, perhaps even now. But but in terms of, as I got kind of more senior, that becomes strangely, in a way, less important. But to kind of have a value proposition to an employer, I think there is those pieces around skill, whether they be researchy sorts of skills or sort of consultancy kind of skills. Those are important, and you can be trained in those areas. And then I think there's the mindset kind of questions around the focus on the problem that I'm trying to solve, as we were discussing earlier.
I feel like that brings the conversation full circle, getting back to this balance, striking a balance between flexibility or amorphousness and rigidity or structure. So we'll leave it there. And Tim, thank you so much for making the time and joining me on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure, Rob.
Thanks for listening to How Brands Are Built. If you like what you heard, please subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, and leave a rating and review. I'd love to hear what you think. To learn more about Tim and Principles, visit principles.com.au. That's Principles with a P-A-L-S at the end. You can also read the episode wrap-up at How Brands Are Built, where you'll find a link to Tim's article in Mumbrella, the one we discussed at the beginning of the conversation. You can also follow How Brands Are Built on Twitter and Instagram, and visit us online at howbrandsarebuilt.com for articles and blog posts, to sign up for the newsletter, or to contact me with any questions or suggestions. How Brands Are Built is a production of Heirloom Agency, LLC. Our theme music is by Isha Erskine Project. I'm Rob Meyerson, and I'll talk to you next time. Thanks again.